Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Designing for the Desert, our ongoing series where we explore how design, technology, and sustainability come together to shape the future of life in arid regions. Every Sunday at 2 p.m. Dubai time, we bring you conversations with leading voices in architecture, urbanism, and environmental design, all centered around one goal: designing better, more resilient, and more human environments for desert cities like Dubai. In our previous episode, we had the pleasure of speaking with Stephen Melagrinis, design director and head of cities practice at Gensler, who shared fascinating insights on ecological urbanism, how cities can evolve as living adaptive systems in harmony with their landscapes. Today, we continue that dialogue with another inspiring voice, Mariam Siddiqui, architect at Edge Architects here in Dubai. Mariam has worked extensively on high rise residential and commercial developments and brings a unique perspective on integrating sustainability practices into modern, high density urban design. Her work reflects a new generation of designers who see sustainability not as an afterthought, but as a foundation, blending innovation, cultural context, and practical design strategies for the desert environment. So let's dive into today's conversation with Maria as we explore how design can respond to climate, community, and context, all while reimagining the future of living in the desert. So, with that, I will hand over to Maria.
Hi, Udit. Good afternoon. And thank you so much for having me. And more importantly, thank you so much for hosting this series. This is absolutely important. And I'll start with exactly where you ended living in the desert. So, the image that we have of living in a desert, what it used to be, and what it is now, and what is the way forward. So, this is such an important dialogue that you've initiated, that you're having and continuing every Sunday at 2. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking spearheading this dialogue, this discussion, which is so important, because as you very rightly said, it's not an afterthought. Sustainability cannot be an afterthought. It has to be the foundation. It has to come even before the concept, I'd say. Most architects would argue that you have to incorporate sustainability engineers and this person and that person and certification experts at the concept stage, but I would argue those come second. Even the concept stage comes second. First you have to have sustainability as a pre-concept for you, and then you design according to it. The master plan comes next, the form comes next, the envelope comes next. The first thing has to be sustainability if we you know want to have a sustainable future. So thanks a lot. um, I would like to start sharing my screen right away, if that's all right with you.
Yes, please do go ahead.
Perfect. Is my screen visible?
Not yet. I think it's just coming on now.
All right.
Mm, I think you might need to share that again.
All right, I'll do that. Is it visible now?
Yes, it's loading now.
Perfect.
Yeah, you need to put it into full screen and we should be good to go.
I did. I just hope it becomes visible soon. Is it full screen yet?
Not yet.
All right, let me just reshare. Okay, I would request a few seconds extra because it's not going in full screen. So I think it should be.
Yes, it's full
It
screen
should
now.
be.
Perfect.
Well, it is.
Yes.
All right. It's full screen and visible, right?
Yes.
All right. Perfect. So the topic that we have today, design for in within designing for the desert, is one really close to me. It is focusing on Dubai's climate responsive innovations. So I think everyone who is an immigrant or everyone who's living away from home, who's chosen a home away from home, would have a special attachment, to of course their own home country, their own home place, and also the place that is their chosen home. And for us, as people who are living in the desert, like we're living in such a desert and in such a time that it's sometimes hard to remember that we're actually in the middle of a desert because of the wonderful innovations that we see, because of the climates that we experience on a day-to-day basis. We are not surrounded by sand the whole day, and we're not facing the heat, the hot winds that the ancestors used to face in this environment. What we live is more of a life of luxury, or I would say protection. Even if it's not luxury, we are living in a very protected environment within the desert. So what we have around us is excellent HVAC, of course. We live in air conditioned buildings. We experience the difference that is there between the indoors and the outdoors. Our culture is shaped according to it. So you would see in the peak of summers in Dubai, or even in Doha, in Riyadh, in any of these arid cities, you would see people waiting for the evening to begin to come up so that the nightlife, I'd say, or just the social scene in itself can start. You don't see people going out in the afternoon, which is a very normal thing in the desert. You wait for the evening to come up and then you go out. That is the time to socialize, that is the time to go out. You um, are basically in ACs, like even in the summers you're using blankets and you're using. I see a lot of people at metro stations wearing jackets because even though it is extremely hot outside, indoors within the metros, within the offices, it's extremely cold. So, what we live is a different life to what our ancestors have lived, and the way forward is going to be dictated by us, decided by us, yes, but mostly dictated by us, because every choice that we make, every decision that we take, is going to dictate the future, what the world looks like maybe 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. So, everything has to be conscious, every decision has to be well thought out. So, before we go in too deep, let's see what are arid climates. When we think of arid climates, we generally only think of the desert, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a desert. You even see in a lot of places you have rain shadows, for example. Those can be near mountains, or then you could have extremely cold climates where you just don't get enough rainfall. There are many, like even in places like Greenland, you'd find arid belts per se. In Australia, you have a very, very large arid region. Of course, here in the Gulf, we do have these arid regions, but then there's not one kind of arid climate. There's semi arid zones, there's hyper arid zones, and there's arid zones. And together, these three combine, they comprise 30% of the entire world. And even I believe more than 30% of the world's population is also living in arid regions. And it's not just the 30, like the 30 is as of now. It's as of right now. But then with global warming, with climate change, even the climate belts, the climate zones are moving. So every year we have many squares of kilometers that are newly added, freshly included in the arid zones. For example, what may not be an arid region today may become an arid region next year. So even if we have people who are like viewing this right now or thinking about arid architecture, desert architecture, arid climates, who are not living in arid regions right now, it is possible that with global warming, with climate change, your region might become an arid region in the coming few years because the climate is actually moving up. So yes, 30% of the world's area, land area, of course, and 30%, a third of the world's population. So that's even more than 30%. The other important thing is, since until now we did not have too much development in the arid regions, for example, Los Angeles, if I talk about, um, had a population of 25 in the year 1900, if I'm not mistaken, and now we see how millions and millions of inhabitants are living there. So, with the development of excellent HVAC systems, with the development of transportation, and not just road transportation, which is private cars, I also mean shipping, marine transportation, logistics around the world, food chains, for example, people in Dubai and in many other arid regions where you don't have too much agriculture, you still can get vegetables and fruits from basically all around the world. So, logistics and shipping also has a huge part to play, and multiple similar factors because of which now these areas are possible to inhabit, and these areas are fresh in a way. Like we see a lot of images of Dubai in the 70s, and then in the 90s, and then in 2010, and now I think we recently surpassed the 4 million mark in 2025. So we see the growth in terms of population, of course, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of buildings, in terms of the food chain and availability. So the rate of population growth in arid regions is expected to be the largest, the highest, like of all cities, because we have fertile lands which are already inhabited. They are growing, of course, but not at the unprecedented rate at which arid regions are growing. So these cities are also supposed to grow at the highest rate of among everything all around the world. So A, the belt is expanding, arid regions are becoming more than they were, and B, they are growing faster than anything else. So these are reasons why we absolutely need to care. So there are hyper-arid regions which basically are devoid of vegetation. Almost though, not entirely, but you might have some native grasses, you might have some shrubs, but that's pretty much it. Then we have arid zones, which are half of all arid regions basically. The arid ones are close to 15%, and then they have sparse vegetation, some rainfall, and then semi-arid zones, which aren't exactly as dry as arid or hyper-arid zones, but then the rainfall is still quite less compared to more temperate regions. And these together comprise the 30% that we talked about earlier. Now, the challenges are many. Like what we have listed here is sort of a simplistic explanation of it. It's just a summing up of the challenges, but it's not limited. The challenges aren't limited to these three. But if we had to sum it up, if we had to make it compressed and concise, the first thing would be the extreme climate, of course. Extreme climate, in terms of vegetation, yes. If vegetation is not there, the first thing which would lead to most of populations settling in a place, most habitations, is agriculture. Like after hunter gatherers, we had the farmers, we had the people who settled and then who farmed the land and then who did agriculture. It is often not possible, and it is often not viable enough. Like there may be regions within arid climates where agriculture is possible, but then not of all different types. Some crops are very water intensive, some crops are not at all water intensive. So you would have cacti, for example, you would have certain other crops which don't require as much water. You might have certain kinds of poultry, but you may not have all kinds of food crops. So, extreme climate, that is the first sub aspect of it, I'd say. Then, another aspect of it is the rainfall, of course, human comfort, the heat, the extreme heat. For example, if you go only by the temperature, only by the numbers, if you compare the temperatures of Delhi and Dubai, at the peak of summers, you would only find maybe a 4-degree difference that is stretching it. Like, for example, if it is 48 in Delhi, it might be 52 in Dubai. So, if you go by the numbers, of course, 50 plus is extreme, but it's not a 10 or 20-degree difference. But then, because of the other factors here, because of the uh, the the fact that it is a desert after all, Like you have a lot of dry air, you have lesser facilities, you don't have water nearby. You do have, like, of course, you do have the sea, but then you don't have water that you can grow crops with because the land doesn't support it. You don't have fertile soil. So the feel of the temperature is vastly different between the two. Human comfort, you would see air conditioners everywhere in Dubai, because without it it's just not possible. It is possible, but not for the entire large population that we now have. Of course, even before air conditioners, people were living in Dubai. It was still an inhabited city, but the growth that we have, the rate that we have, is only possible because of modern HVAC, modern transportation. Bedouins were there; they still traveled. We still had caravans, we still had trade, but then the rate that it is at right now would not have been possible with the raw climate of Dubai, the extreme climate. Scarcity, water shortage, it leads to multiple things. Of course, we talked about the crops, but then also buildings are one of the largest users of potable water. You don't just need water for drinking, you also need it for like laundry, you also need it for washing dishes, you also need it for hygiene, for sanitation, for plants, for everything. So, scarcity is also a major challenge, and this includes resources, not just water, but then resources in general. And then expectations. If we want Dubai to stay the international city that it is, the international hub, the destination that it is, with people from basically all around the world, we have to have the ability to support multiple lifestyles. We have to have luxury, we have to have economic options, luxurious options, different lifestyles, different foods, different everything. So, what we call modern lifestyle is basically the modern expectations. So, if we talk about cities and arid environments, resource management, food production, increasing temperatures. This is what we just talked about. But then we saw a huge change in the last 60 to 70 years, in the last century even. We talked about logistical systems, transportation, we talked about water management, we talked about HVAC. And then, as we talked about Las Vegas, I think I misspoke earlier. So, Las Vegas was only at 25 people in 1900, and now we have millions and millions of inhabitants. So, the image that I have on this screen is of Rajkumari Ratnavati School, which is in Rajasthan in India. And this image here is used because of the stark contrast. Dubai right now is at a much more advanced stage. But then this school, which was very recently designed, I think less than 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, it uses local materials, it uses local forms, local everything, local plants, and then the indoor temperature and the outdoor temperature are are very very different. There are stark differences. So we'll come back to how, but then it's just a good reminder that not all desert cities are like Dubai, or Doha, or Riyadh. We still have cities that look very different, and even within these cities, we have different levels of advancement and development. Before continuing, Udit, if you could just give me a heads up, are we like, is everything still visible, audible?
Yes, audible, visible. You have enough time. There's no rush.
All right, perfect. So, yes, this is Dubai now. So, even within this image, I see three different things. I see old Dubai, what is like generally called old Dubai, and then we have the line of high rises, the skyscrapers along Sheikh Zayed Road, and then we have water, in which also we have a lot of. I don't want to use the word encroachment, but then we do have a lot of islands which are natural as well, and then which are man-made as well within Dubai. So even within one arid city, or even within any city, we can have multiple cities. Like the experience that you would have in the middle of this image would be very different to the experience you would have at the beginning of this image or at the end of this image. So it is very important to remember that within an arid city, the experiences, the resource intensiveness, the lifestyle, the quality of life, everything, the sort of mechanisms you would be using, the dependence that you would have with the outdoors, on the outdoors, on your transportation, your private transportation, your cars or something, or on public transportation, on the metro, on the buses, or even if you go towards the end of this image, the dependence that you would have even on marine transportation. Because this is something that is sort of a luxury, I'd say, that we've had since time immemorial, which we don't have in landlocked cities: water transportation, marine transportation. In landlocked cities, you don't really have boats, but then in Dubai, for example, you have the concept of abras, then you have the dhow cruises, which is a more touristy experience, then you would have yachts, then you would have, ships and everything. So even within that, like there are vessels of marine transportation that bring in the resources to us. There are vessels of marine transportation that transport us from one place to another, and then there are vessels of marine transportation that work as sort of leisure for us, that are more recreational for us. So even within this image, there are three Dubais that I see just from bird's eye view, and then even within each building there are multiple more. Within each villa that we see, within each building, within each skyscraper, there are multiple cities. In a way, there are multiple lifestyles, there are multiple people, and then those dictate what the building needs to have. The lifestyle is dictated by the building, and the building is dictated by the requirements. So we'll come back to that. We do have a lot of interdependence. Buildings, especially in regions like Dubai, I'm focusing more on Dubai and not just on arid regions or on cities in general, because that is where we are and that is the topic for today. But then in Dubai specifically, even if it is the winters, even if it is the peak of winters, it's not snowing, it's not 0 degrees, it's not very cold. So even cooler weather is pleasant weather. It's very pleasant weather. You don't have a lot of dependence on HVAC or on mechanical cooling. But then, for the most part of the year, buildings need to be cooled down for inhabitants. And then, on the other hand, buildings do impact their environments, their immediate vicinities. So, for example, this could be because of the thermal masses of everything, the thermal loads, and whatever is inside the material, the inside each block of the building. Then it could be because of the inhabitants, because of the people who are roaming around within the building, and more importantly, I would say, not more importantly, but I would say on a much bigger scale and on a more everyday scale, the cooling of the buildings leads to exhausts that can heat up the surroundings. So if the building is giving out heat, it is heating up its immediate vicinity. If the building is giving out cooler air, then that is cooling down its immediate vicinity. So the conventional HVAC systems that we do use at the moment often comprise of the cooler exhaust air coming out at the rooftops. So earlier we had the concept of rooftops. People used to go on the rooftops, and then we would have any like get together or anything. But then as skyscrapers are rising, the number of skyscrapers is rising, the concept of rooftops is decreasing. Of course, that is one safety concern as well. But then also rooftops are now HVAC zones. Rooftops are not generally accessible. If you look at higher rise buildings, you would have lower rise buildings that still have accessible rooftops, of course. And even at high rise buildings, we often have terraces at higher levels, or maybe half of the rooftop is an HVAC zone and a part of it is accessible, but which is quite rare. So the HVAC zones that we have on the rooftops, on the top of the buildings, or even on service levels, are a mix of different types of exhausts. So there are rooms that require air conditioning the whole time. Like there are service rooms that need to be air conditioned. There are service rooms that need to be ventilated, which do not have air conditioning, should not have air conditioning, which would have louvers. You might see in a lot of the taller buildings, in a lot of the towers around you, you would have one floor in the middle, which is sort of breaking the building into two. You see one design element, which is, of course, it is a design element, but it is for a reason. It is the service level. So that service level needs to be ventilated. But then on that service level, we do have a lot of exhausts as well. These exhausts are generally released at higher levels. So there are certain types of exhausts which have, like, they are under the safety levels for inhalation. when mixed with normal air. So, for example, the cooler exhausts that are being released at the rooftop, if they're reduced at the street level, let's say, at the entrance level, maybe towards the back of the building, maybe towards the sides of the building. Of course, we wouldn't want the exhausts coming out at the front of the building, neither as a design element, not as a comfort element. But we might have these exhausts coming out and releasing their exhaust, releasing their fumes. Fumes is a stronger word, but basically fumes, yes. If we have them being released towards the podium levels, for example, or the street, the pedestrian areas, the landscape levels, in those cases they get mixed with normal air and they are very, very safe to inhale as well. They are very, very safe for human comfort and for human health. So, in these cases, the immediate vicinity of the building can actually be cooled down, and especially at the levels where humans are interacting with it, especially where people are walking around the buildings, people are interacting with the facade of the building, with the exterior of the building. That can become a more pleasant experience without additional mechanical costs, basically, without additional ventilation, without additional cooling. We do have some cooling examples, for example, in Doha, where the streets are sort of air conditioned, um, which is a great concept, which is an excellent concept. But of course, everything has its costs associated with it, monetary costs and environmental costs. So in these cases, if we use the fumes that are already coming out of the buildings, only the safe ones, and then we exhaust them towards humans, that can be a good use of something that is existing, and we can enhance comfort with it. So this would basically, this interdependence that we have, it would enhance each other. Buildings would be cooled down for inhabitants, and then buildings would also cool down their surroundings a little bit. So what are the things that we need to take care of? Again, it is sort of a simplistic explanation, a simplistic summing up, but then the most essential aspects, I would say, are materials, energy consumption, water, and health. Within these, of course, we have subgroups, we have subcategorizations, but then if we look at the materials, a lot of people talk about the mud bricks that have traditionally been used in deserts. They are, of course, used for a reason. Whatever Mother Nature provides us in one place, that is there for a reason. Like we see this in flora, we see this in fauna, and we also see this in architecture. We also see this in building materials. So, of course, mud bricks are there, but then also there are many advantages of even things like concrete. There are advantages of steel structures, there are advantages of wood, there are advantages of bamboo. So, what material we're using for what requirement is very, very important and needs to be well thought out. Minimizing energy consumption. This is within itself a big topic, but then it is also dependent on the materials that we use. The materials that we use may or may not minimize energy consumption. If they minimize energy consumption, they also minimize the water usage. They also optimize the health of the building, the environment, and human health. So, health is not just human health, health is the health of the building as well, which is very important. And health is the health of the environment, because when we talk about sustainability, of course, that's not just the earth, that is human sustainability as well. The sustainability of life in general, like the human species, the different animal species that we have, the different materials, flora and fauna that we have, nothing should go extinct, nothing should get endangered. So that, building health also, and of course the overall health of the earth. So yeah, when we minimize energy consumption, when we use well thought out materials, as a byproduct, the use of water is decreased. The use of water not for human consumption, of course, like drink ample water even if you're living in a green building, in a sustainable building, but the use of water in terms of mechanical requirements, in terms of HVAC cooling requirements, in terms of not just cooling requirements. For example, the landscape that you have in the building, the plants that you have in the building, you can use the same water for them. We'll come to that. We'll come to that at a later slide. But then, overall, in general, these three lead to the optimum health of the building, of the inhabitants, and of the earth. So, we are not the first ones to think about sustainability. We are not the first ones to think about our own health and the health of the earth. Of course, the issue was not as present back at the time of our ancestors. It wasn't as pressing, it wasn't as crucial. Now we are at a do or die stage. But even earlier, the aim, of course, was longevity. The aim, of course, was sustainability. No one would want to like do something and then redo it and then redo it. And then, of course, traditional methods, while not built necessarily for the sake of sustainability or conserving the earth, a lot of the times these are the more comfortable options as well. When it comes to occupant comfort, when it comes to occupant health, when it comes to the health of the city, the sustainable methods are generally the comfortable methods. So, what did we have historically? Like, first we'll talk about the history, then we'll talk about the newer methods and the technological advancements that we now have and that we can now use. Earlier desert dwellings, of course, they used the materials which were present there. We were not too big on transportation. Of course, transportation was possible even earlier, but then we would see more of transported materials at like landmark destinations, which were built as memorials or as tributes, as even homages. We would see transported materials because it was a big deal, like the marble for this monument was transported from this place and so on. But then in the cities, in the dwellings, in the houses, you would see clay, you would see stone, you would see rammed earth, and these are all materials with high thermal masses, so they absorb a lot of heat during the day, which is required because you don't want all the heat to be transported inside the house. You want the walls to absorb the heat. And then at night, when, especially in desert conditions, when it becomes colder, the heat would get released. So we don't face this, I think, to that noticeable of an extent in desert cities now. But then, if I talk about desert villages, which were the ancestors of these desert cities that we now live in, this effect was way more noticeable. And then, especially in places that are nearer to the sea, that are nearer to the creek, even to the water, you see the difference in climate even now much more during the day and during the night. So these materials, the ones that have high thermal mass, were the right choice and were the absolute requirement, were the need, the necessity of the time. So that's one. Another thing is the thicker walls. We do still see a lot of thick walls in Dubai, of course, and then in a lot of areas with more extreme temperatures because we want protection from the sun during the day. And even you would see in a lot of cities, even in India and all around the world, you had a lot of carvings in desert architecture. So those would be to increase the surface area. The more the surface area is that interacts with the sun, the more absorption happens. So a flat surface versus an entirely carved surface would have a significant difference in the surface area. So yeah, and then a little segue basically. We are talking about traditional methods and traditional materials, but then what we now have, for example, I'm not sure if you're aware, Udit, we have this thing called CoLab in Design District within Dubai. So it's a material library. I'm mentioning it because I'm in love with the place, and you have such sustainable materials there, such innovative materials there. For example, you would have tiles maybe made from palm fronds or coconut hair or banana peels or date seeds. So things that are available here, things that are in everyday use, have been collected and have been turned into building materials. So those could be tiles, those could be um, fake wood, fake concrete. I use fake, the term fake, because it's not technically wood, but then it's basically the same or even better. Like the insulation would be better, the properties would be better, the sturdiness would be better. But we have a ton of these materials. So yeah, traditional materials are of course there, and then from traditional materials we have newer innovations which are sourced from traditional materials. But from coming back to our traditional ancestor villages, I'd say, even which Dubai was until a very recent time, you we would have palm fronds and animal hair, which were all used within the mud bricks, incorporated with the mud bricks or for the roofs or for covering the windows and so on. And then these would provide a lot of insulation. So this is when we talk about the house itself, the unit, the dwelling unit itself. But then also within the house complex, we'd have wind catchers. If not in the house complex, in the mosque complex, in the government building complex, in the built context of the, not even the city, not even the village or the district, a group of houses maybe. You would see a lot of wind catchers there that would direct airflow into the houses. You would see a lot of inner courtyards. So the inner courtyards have two main purposes. So the first is, of course, trapping the cool air and enhancing ventilation, of course, and the second would be privacy. For example, in Bedouin cultures, in Islamic cultures, and in many different cultures, privacy and the distinction between the indoors, the house, and the outdoors is very strict. So in those cases, of course, the inner courtyard works as a good outdoor space, which is inside the house, a place for the women and for the children and for everyone, the family, the unit of the family itself, without being out in a common park or a common courtyard. We would have, of course, a lot of common courtyards between multiple houses, but then also individual houses had their own courtyards. So it was multi-leveled. Then Mashrabia, which is still very, very prominent here. And even we would see Mashrabia, which is the screen that we see on the screen right now, the lattice, the jali, whatever you want to call it, which filters light and which filters air and which provides a lot of ventilation. So we do see a lot of Mashrabia patterns and a lot of modern adaptations of it also in today's architecture. We even see these in skyscrapers, in like the podium levels of parkings, or in even parametric buildings. They're now more enhanced using computational design and stuff. But it is still a very important aspect of desert architecture, of arid architecture, and of the architecture of specifically this region, I'd say, for this specific kind of mashrabia. But we do see lattices in different desert climates in general. So yeah, we talked about courtyards, we talked about mashrabias. Roofs are also important because people would sleep on the roofs earlier. Nighttime is generally cooler, so people use the roofs to sleep on. Roofs were thicker so that not a lot of sunlight would penetrate into the house. And then at later stages now, and even in the future, roofs can be used for solar panels, photovoltaic panels as well. The urban planning that we had in ancient cities and desert cities was very clustered. So this image that I have on my screen right now is like both of these images are from Shibam, which is a city in Yemen, which was historically, not historically, but which was sort of a skyscraper town in a more ancient sense. So this is, I think, as old as 500 BC, or but it's quite old. I'm not sure about the dates. It was destroyed. Then again, it was built. It is dense. It is clustered, but it is one of the pioneers of vertical living, because you wouldn't see a lot of high rises in general in ancient cities, in more older cities, especially in these arid regions that we are in. We're talking about right now, for example, Dubai. But this city, I think it was rebuilt in the 1500s. So even then, it was a pioneer. And as we see in the image right now, it is clustered. So why is it clustered? What's the benefit of it being clustered? The closer the buildings are to themselves, the lesser space there is for like sunlight and heat to penetrate the buildings. So that is one reason why they're clustered. The second thing is, of course, shading. The narrow streets, the dense layouts, they reduce dust, they reduce sun exposure, and the microclimate within the city becomes more livable. And of course, the height is a plus. The height causes more shading, it gives more advantage in that sense as well. So, yeah, cooler night air, reduced heat gain, shaded pedestrian networks. Then another aspect of ancient desert cities was north-south airflow. Like the streets were designed in such a way, the courtyards were designed in such a way that east-west solar exposure was minimized and north-south airflow was prioritized. So for this, it's a very beautiful concept. When you travel to like different places, you hear different names for the wind, different winds that they prefer. So even in like my ancestral home, I have heard different terms for like the southwestern winds and the northeastern winds and this and that. So it's, I think, more I don't want to say universal, but then more common in our parts of the world where we try to avoid the sun as much as possible. And then, of course, there are different types of climates where the sun is more welcome, but definitely not here, not in Dubai, where we want to reduce the sun exposure, the solar heat gain for a large part of the year. So the prevailing wind directions are followed and are appreciated and are enhanced. So another example would be the traditional older city, older parts of Cairo and Damascus. So where we would see the actual layout of the city. Now that we've talked a little bit about the older strategies that were used in ancient desert cities, and ancient is a broad term, but then even until fairly recently, let's talk about the technological advancements that we now have. One benefit that we have with computational design, for example, is we know how buildings are going to react. We know how materials are going to impact the buildings. We know how orientation is going to affect the buildings. And then, with, for example, BIM and with more computation and the present scales that we have, the present softwares that we have a good idea to understand how every material would absorb heat, how it would conduct heat, and how it would radiate heat. So the aim would be to try to maximize absorption so that the walls of the building work as a barrier for us, like the people who are inside the building are shaded through the walls itself. Then conduction is there, and then radiation. We want as little radiation as possible because we don't want the heat to like radiate inside the building. So that's one. Then wind studies that we now have, wind studies, wind tunnel studies, both of them, we can physically see how airflow would affect the building. So of course this would include the stack effect, this would include skyscrapers, this would this is important for HVAC, yes. This is important for our comfort, yes. But this is also very important for structural design. For example, if we just design a building and not worry about the airflow at an earlier stage, and then we later involve structural engineers and wind study experts, and we analyze the wind of the wind interactions of the building, we would find out that wind loads are higher than we expected because of the specific orientation of the building or because of the wind behavior at that instance. The reaction is different than what we expected, and because of that, structurally the loads increase, because of course the wind is not just affecting our comfort or our HVAC. It is physically hitting the building, like the building is standing there, and the wind can either work around it, the wind can either help us, or the wind can be a barrier for the building. We don't want the wind to be a barrier, we don't want wind to be an obstacle, we don't want shaking within the building, and we don't want the building to fall down. We don't want even once in a 50-year scenario where the winds are extremely strong, where there's a storm or something, even in that case, like that is the case that the building should be able to withstand. That is not the case where the building should fall down. That is the worst case scenario that we design for, that we account for. So now, with the technological advancements, with modern softwares, with modern studies, we have engineers who are trained specifically for this, who tell us about airflow and about wind reactions with the building. So that's there. Then 3D rendering. How does 3D rendering help us? 3D rendering is a tool for marketing, of course. But then with marketing, we also have 3D rendering for shading, for example. So the materials that we use in our BIM model, the materials that we incorporate in the building, are the materials that we use for the renders. So they simulate how exactly the building is interacting with the climate, how it is interacting with the resources, how it is interacting with its environment. So that's another thing that we have at our benefit now, at our disposal, another tool that we have. 3D printing. So 3D printing was used for smaller things when it started, but then now we even have buildings, entire houses that are 3D printed. We even have like recently, not very long ago, the first 3D printed building in Dubai was constructed. So these are all advancements that have come up within the last maybe 50 years or something. So these are tools that we have to use right from the beginning. 3D printing can be used for materials, for individual blocks, for individual items, but then even using native materials, we can smaller houses, for example, at this stage. But then I'm sure at a later stage, when it becomes more economical and more common, we would be able to print entire skyscrapers, maybe. Building management systems, they are absolutely important because they help us regulate the um, energy usage within the building. So this includes the facade if we have a kinetic facade. This includes the HVAC systems, the mechanical systems, the ventilation systems of the building. So when we talk about intelligent buildings, often what comes to our mind is a smart lock and, hey Alexa, hey Siri, because that's what the developers market to us as a smart home and a smart intelligent home. But then that's not it. That's a very, very small aspect of it. That's just automation for your own home. But then within the context of the entire building, and even at more advanced stages of neighborhoods, of like systems of buildings, we have building management systems which can regulate the mechanical and ventilation and thermal loads of the building, and facades wherever applicable. Recycle water systems, so reducing the usage of water within the building, and then also using grey water wherever we can. HVAC systems we already talked about, and then solar energy, of course. Like, this is a an amazing resource that we have at our disposal here in desert climates. We have ample sun. We don't have any shortage of the sun. So what we need is the right orientation, and then we have huge, huge, huge surplus of sunlight, I'd say, which can be harnessed. What are the aims for like modern strategies? What are the aims of it? The first thing is combating the urban heat island effect. Of course, this is not at the building level, if I'm talking about one building that I'm designing or constructing. But when we talk about a group of buildings in especially arid regions, urban heat island effect is very prominent. We cannot we cannot cement the desert completely, because the heat that is within the earth also needs an outlet. So we have to leave patches. We need to combat the urban island effect. Sorry, we need to have patches of the desert that are open, which also connects us to the environment. It connects us to our surroundings, the natural habitat that we live in. But also it is essential. It is absolutely important. Unconventional HVAC systems that we talked about, which can cool the buildings around, cool the vicinity of the building. Biodiversity. Biodiversity needs to be conserved. What are the native plants of Dubai? What are the native birds of Dubai? What are the native species of flora and fauna in general? We do have reserves here. We do have wildlife conservation parks here, but that's not the extent of it. The native flora and fauna should not be bottled up in one corner in one wildlife reserve while we change the rest of it, because that leads to floods, as we saw, that leads to the extinction or endangerment of native species, that leads to a lot of harm in terms of the climate, in terms of the health of the earth, and that's not sustainable, as we talked about. So, of course, we need to incorporate the biodiversity that we have. This can be in the form of green roofs, this can be in the form of blue roofs that we'll talk about soon. It can be in the form of xeriscapes, landscapes that we have that incorporate the existing or the native biodiversity. And we can welcome the birds that we have around us. We can welcome the harmless lifestyle, and we can protect the even the harmful life that we have around us, even the animals that can potentially be dangerous. We do not still want to endanger them. We have to work out strategies for their life as well, because ultimately they're important for the sustainability of the earth in general. Permeable pavements, because water, of course, as we talked about, is crucial in arid environments. Permeable pavements, they have a reserve. They save the water, basically. They store the water, and then that water can be used later for us or for the landscape. Productive landscapes, again, we'll come to that. Walkable spaces are very important. The more number of cars we have, the more fumes we have, the worse it is for the environment. So the more we can reduce the dependence on cars, it is better. Grey water. So grey water and then the last point, battling stigma, are sort of related. Grey water at the moment we see in a lot of like wonderful buildings. We see grey water being used for flushes. We see grey water being used for car washes, like washing the car. We see grey water being used for plants. But then ultimately there is a lot of stigma when it comes to recycled water. What we don't realize is that all the water we're drinking basically is recycled. Like, we are not drinking new water. The water in the earth is sort of contained. There is this entire cycle and rainfall and this and that, but we are not drinking new water. But then, if you tell someone that this is recycled water, would you want to have a glass of it? They would most likely say no. I think there was a recent US survey which said that more than 62%, so around 62% of people were against recycled water or something. I'm not sure of the exact survey or the name of the survey, but then that is why innovation and research is important, and battling the stigma is required, because we are all drinking recycled water anyway. So, site orientation and passive cooling, they are sort of similar. I would say they're part of the same thing, because passive cooling is a bigger umbrella and site orientation is a major part of it. So we do need good site orientation, as we talked about the ancient strategies as well. It is absolutely important here, because we talked about the wind, we talked about the structural loads, and of course we want to minimize sun exposure as much as we can to the like longer facades. But of course, it is not unavoidable. There will be a side that is still exposed to the sun. So for that, we have shading systems. We do have lattices, we do have mashrabiyas, we do have concrete structures even that form skins for the building. So, for example, there are quite a few examples within Dubai. I think O14 building in Business Bay is a very good example of it, and a few more. But then we do have adjustable lowers, we have kinetic facades. So one example of this would be the Pineapple building that we have in Abu Dhabi. So the lowers, I think I have a more detailed, yeah, Al Bahar Towers, this is the one. It's generally called Pineapple building, but yeah, Al Bahar Towers is the official name of it. These are the kinetic lowers that change according to the requirement. So they're adjustable, they're automatic, and they're kinetic. So, if not to that extent, to still a very large extent, we do need them. Natural ventilation is required, evaporative cooling. We talked about courtyards. A lot of the courtyards in older homes also have a water body, a central water feature, which is called a hose. So, what the hose does is, the wind as it passes above the water, it cools the wind down, and then it goes into the rest of the courtyard and the verandas of the house, the rooms of the house. So within the house, we have evaporative cooling of the wind because of this water. Another thing that can help do that is greenery, or like cooling panels in a more modern context. So yes, thermal mass with modern insulation. We do have stone, concrete, adobe. We have different materials now. We can combine them with modern insulation. We do require large aspect of modern insulation, especially when we talk about glass facades, when we talk about skyscrapers. But even in the smaller buildings, we do need modern insulation. One strategy that we see sometimes, not very often, but we see sometimes, is buildings or houses that are sort of embedded into the earth. So they're not basements, but they're not going up, they're going down. So that is a very good strategy to keep the house cooler. But of course, that's not possible everywhere, and especially with like rains and stuff. It's quite a hassle at times. So the buildings that are going up, and as like higher the building goes, the more the insulation we need to a large extent. So the more the insulation we need, the more ventilation we need, the more shading we need, the more energy we need. But we cannot just spend energy. We have to be efficient when we talk about energy. So, of course, we do have certification systems. LEED is there, and then the buildings need to be designed as per ASHRAE codes and this and that. UAE has its own systems as well. There's SAFA, there's Istidama. But then it's not just about the certification. Like, it's not just about certification for the sake of it, or for the sake of increasing the cost while we sell units, or for the sake of it becoming a star project with lots of awards and so on. But in energy efficiency can be achieved even with very, very small details. So that solar panels, battery storage for nighttime energy use. This is sort of related to the solar panels that we talked about, the heat gain as well, and then solar energy as well. Geothermal systems. The simplistic example would be the house that is built underground, but then of course we have geothermal energy systems as well for heating and cooling. Facade treatment, again, building orientation we already talked about, and biodiversity conservation. Drip irrigation and xeriscaping. what is xeriscaping? Xeriscaping is using the native plants, using the native elements of an area, and incorporating them in our landscape. So xeriscape is can be thought of as a type of landscape, but as a type of suited landscape that is designed specifically for our region, for this region. Artificial ponds, as we talked about, the horse that used to be, innovative materials. Finite is one example, but then we talked about Colab. So whoever is in Dubai, I would recommend giving a visit to Colab or any other material libraries where we have newer materials. It honestly opened my eyes a lot because there were things that I didn't even know could be used as building materials, and they were there. So it was wonderful to see that. And of course, locally sourced materials are essential. And then smart home systems, intelligent buildings for lighting, ventilation, temperature. When we see the courtyard itself and we see the water body that we have in the middle, so this here we'll talk about the thermal behavior, how buildings absorb, conduct, and radiate heat that we touched upon earlier. So the materials that have high reflectivity absorb less solar energy. So high reflectivity basically means that the solar energy that's coming is getting reflected. It's in the word. So it's getting reflected away. And thermal mass, like the more dense the material is, the more it'll absorb heat during the day and it'll release it during the night. So we need the right types of materials for the right places. Low conductivity materials, they conduct heat but at a very low pace, of course. High conductivity materials like metals and glass, metals we all know, of course, you touch a metal when it is hot because of its conduction. Glass, now we have like more than 100 different types of glass, probably with different radiations and different conductivity and different even the tint of the glass itself is very important in an environment like ours. So thermal conductivity is essential. Like looking at it is essential because we would use different types of glasses in a villa, and we'd use different types of glass in a skyscraper. We'd use a different types of glass for our car windows. We'd use different kinds of glass for everything. So these are things that need to be kept in mind. The thermal behavior and the overall performance. Heat storage, we already talked about the mud bricks and how much heat is emitted by the material, how much heat is absorbed by the material. So for arid climates, we want high thermal mass, we want low conductivity, and we want reflective roofs. So if we break it down, we want to reflect away all the heat that is coming from the roof. We want the walls to not send the heat inside, and we want the thermal mass, the blocks themselves, we want them to absorb the heat that we have. Green roofs, shading devices, of course. Green roofs impact the indoor comfort as well. They're not just good for the environment. Of course, they're good for the environment because one piece of land, we can give the same amount of land back to the earth through the green roof, and then we can have green facades as well, which can multiply the impact even more. So we can have one parcel of land and we can have, let's say, five green surfaces. So that is possible, but then also they're excellent for indoor thermal comfort and for, of course, reducing the dependence on mechanical systems. We use computational design to reduce solar radiation. This is again Al Bahar Towers from Abu Dhabi. We can predict thermal performance. We can optimize daylighting. We can optimize airflow, the design of the building, the form of the building, and the thermal comfort of the occupants within the building. Optimizing does not mean reducing. Optimizing does not mean maximizing. Optimization is the ideal amount that is required, the ideal amount of heat, the ideal amount of daylight. We don't want to cut off daylight and we don't want to have too much of it. So optimization would be the right balance. Same when it comes to thermal gain. The same is when it comes to radiation. So that's that. Daylighting studies are required for that. Energy efficiency studies are required for that. And then our buildings can be climate responsive in this environment. We already talked about blue roofs and xeriscaping. Blue roofs filter and store storm water. So when it rains, we can store the storm water and then it can slowly be released back into the earth or back into the environment to be filtered. And then xeriscaping is, of course, using plant species for effectiveness. Then we already, yeah, this is again an example of xeriscaping where native species have been used. This is an example of vertical gardens. This is from Milan. So this of course not in Dubai, but then we have similar examples in Dubai of like green facades. But then in this case, this is basically a forest. So we have one forest in the middle of the city. There are a lot of examples which compare even like some vertical gardens to as much benefits, as much positive influence on the city as Central Park in New York. So that's of course wonderful. Water efficiency, recycling strategies, the water from the water that is used, the grey water can be used for plants, for car washing, for like laundry water, of course, can be used. This is something new. Fog and dew harvesting. I mean, it's not new, but it's not talked about. So, fog and dew harvesting is absolutely a very innovative technique, but it's not new to us. It was used in ancient times as well. But then, this is a photo of Dubai during fog, which is something we absolutely love. But then, we don't realize that even this fog and dew can, every droplet counts, right? So, even this can be used. We can optimize harvesting of this fog and dew using modern technology, but then there are meshes that are available for this that intercept water droplets from the fog. Or even like for the dew, we can have surfaces that radiate heat at night, and then it condenses the water and helps us use it. So this is just like we are at the end now, but this is just something that really speaks to me. There are so many different faces of desert architecture. There's not one thing where we started, what used to be the image that we have in our minds, and what the way forward is. Like these three buildings are from the same region. The one on the extreme left is from Business Bay in Dubai. This is the O14 Tower. Then the one in the middle is the house, the personal residence of architect Sami Angavi. This is in Saudi. And on the right, of course, is the landmark Burj Al Arab. So they look very different. They look so different to each other within like these photos and together on this slide. But these are all part of the same region. These are the different faces of desert architecture. And there are so many ways for like building within desert architecture. Ultimately, it's about our requirements, our priorities, and how we incorporate our requirements with the requirements of the earth. So, yep, that is. I hope this was um,
Thank you.
information.
Thank you very much. We definitely ran about 2 or 3 times over the time limit. However, it was a very, very detailed presentation. I think you covered a lot of different aspects in one go. So thank you, Mariam, for
I'm
having
glad.
such an articulated presentation. What really
Thank
stood
you.
out was how you highlighted the balance between luxury and livability. And that's something I think which is kind of the most explored part of designing and building for the buy, right? Both need to be going hand in hand. And while we always kind of prioritize luxury because that's what aligns with the brand, livability is something that then has to be integrated, developed, evolved into every design. So whether it's high-rise developments, where you're looking at thermal comfort for humans, shading, material performance, all of these things become so crucial in a desert climate. And another thing that I also appreciated was the emphasis on adaptive design strategies. So, while we talk about passive strategies, adaptive strategies, we're looking at what does the facade really do when it's, interacting with the climate. And it's also very intriguing for the buyer, especially because there's so many different kinds of weather conditions and climates that it cycles through in a single year. Where, you showed us that example of how there's fog in Dubai, or when it was raining heavily and there were floods in Dubai, or when 2 times of the year when it's extremely humid and hot, and then it's also extremely cold and dry. And so, these complementary and diverse weather conditions are also something that makes it very interesting as to how this interacts with the build form, which has, which we're trying to make comfortable, breathable, and also in a dense vertical kind of a fabric for people and community. So it's a great reminder that sustainability in the desert isn't only about technology, but also about thoughtful design and something that responds to everything from people, culture, the climatic context, and all of these different aspects together. So with that, let's open the floor for a short question answer round. We're going to have to keep this really quick because we've kind of consumed the entire 1 hour of the webinar on the presentation. Um, so in the meantime, I'd also request the audience to kind of think about what kind of questions you'd like to ask Mariam. And in the meantime, I'm going to kind of begin our question answer round. So let's dive into that. So number one, in your experience, what makes designing for Dubai's desert climate truly different from any other region?
I think this is a wonderful question, and I would come back to where we started just now, livability and luxury both. So, of course, Dubai has been marketed as this international destination, which it truly is. But also, a lot of the times we see a lot of heat, for example, when it comes to the lower income groups in Dubai, we see a lot of heat like not literal heat which we do have in Dubai, but then the metaphorical heat that a lot of people do give Dubai for the difference in the lifestyles of the higher income groups and the lower income groups. So I think we have to keep in mind that Dubai is, of course, there are people who are living in Dubai, there are people who are extremely high income group, and there are people who are building Dubai. So we cannot ignore one and look at the other. So livability in Dubai is keeping all the social classes, all the economic classes together. Of course, we have to adapt to the surroundings. And then one more thing that we have to keep in mind, specifically when it comes to Dubai, like not even the entire UAE, specifically when it comes to Dubai, is that Dubai is seen as inspiration by many cities in the region. So Dubai has done a wonderful job of marketing itself as this luxury destination, even like only for its tourism people do visit to Dubai, not for like other things, even if they're not living in Dubai or for business or something. So a lot of the cities in the region do look up to Dubai. So what we do here sets an example. What we do here is the precedent for many other cities within this region, and I'm sure around the world as well.
Fantastic. So in desert cities, heat mitigation often leads us to create these completely insular, completely sealed off spaces, which we're kind of running our air conditioning for. So, in your opinion, or as a designer, how do you think that we could reintroduce natural ventilation and also maybe the outdoor comfort, thermal comfort in the outdoors around the buildings, without compromising on our energy efficiency goals and targets, and kind of maybe even improving our energy efficiency of the building?
Right. So we cannot, of course, compromise on the energy efficiency. We also cannot compromise on occupant comfort. These are the two things that are always fighting with each other. These are the two things that are always battling each other. So in this case, what we can do is we can bring back some of the aspects of desert architecture that used to be that we talked about. So we can bring back the wind catchers, we can bring back the courtyards, we can bring back narrower residential areas. So of course, in here in Dubai, we do have very wide roads which attract a lot of heat. There's so much concrete and asphalt and everything, so which is required. But then for example, I think in Masdar city or in one of the sustainable cities within Dubai, there's this concept that when you enter, there's a parking lot, you park your car, and then there are buggies, there are golf carts that take you to your house. So the connectivity is not exactly door to door using your car, but then the region itself, in this case, can be more dense. We can reduce the width of the roads because we like why are the roads wider? Because we want to have multiple lanes, we have all these high speed cars and this and that. So if we make our cities denser, if we make our streets denser, especially in the residential areas, of course we cannot apply this principle to Sheikh Zayed, but then to Sheikh Zayed Road, I mean. But then, of course, we have to have different strategies for different areas. That's one. And then another thing would be the spreading out of even economic activities. So in Dubai, what I personally feel is that, for example, if we look at the example of Business Bay, I would say majority of the offices in Dubai are in Business Bay, which leads to a lot of dependence on public transport, on a lot of dependence on cars, on private transport. If you go to the metro station at Business Bay at like 6:30 or 7, a lot of the times it's the metro connectivity is amazing. There are metros coming every 1 minute, but then even then the station is full, and then there are people waiting outside. So if this becomes more spread out, if we have offices more towards the areas which people go less towards at the moment, that would also lead to the undensification. That's not a word, but my point is that can help the city in general, and on a more residential scale, on a more building scale, bringing back the older elements like wind catchers and the water bodies, the horse that we talked about, the mashrabiyas, and so on, and making the city walkable, making our residential complexes walkable. Of course, I cannot walk from here to, like, from Abu Dhabi to Sharjah. Dubai cannot be walkable, but then my vicinity can be walkable, and all individual vicinities can be walkable within themselves. So that would lead to a lot of densification of the streets in general, and a lot of shading, a lot of climate control, lesser roads, more habitable spaces, more outdoor experiences.
All right. So definitely more than one ways in which one can improve this and integrate some of these ideas in. And of course, a lot of challenges there as well. Some of it needs to be kind of part of a master plan in order for them to work. Coming to my next question, many of Dubai's upcoming districts aim to achieve LEED and wellness, right? And these standards are something they're trying to achieve. So, what challenges do designers face in meeting these criteria while also trying to keep projects commercially viable?
Right. So the biggest challenges that come in these cases are when this comes as an afterthought. So, for example, in many of the bigger corporations, in many of the nicer companies, for example, like there were a few projects that I worked on in one old office of mine as well. So, in the company, within the mechanical team, within the engineering team, within the engineering team, we do have people who are there to simplify the certification requirements. Example, are we connected? Yeah. So, for example,
Yes,
at the
go ahead.
time of concept development, yeah. So, at the time of concept development and the initial discussions of the building, even before the form is finalized, there are people, like, this is the way to mitigate those challenges basically. There are people who are not just talking about the requirements, this bullet point, this bullet point, this checklist needs to be checked off, ticked off. There are people are whose job is to simplify those requirements for everyone. So, for example, as an architect, or as a structural engineer, or as an MEP engineer, or as an interior designer, as a landscape architect, everyone may not know what exactly is required. What exactly does this clause mean, or this sub clause of this point number mean? So in those cases, these people, they work as excellent bridges. They can be mechanical engineers, they can be energy engineers, they can be architects with specialization, but they help us bridge the gap between these technical requirements and how it translates into design. So once we have that, for example, at the earlier stage, when we realize that this complex needs to be workable, the site needs to be sustainable. So, for example, if you're talking about LEED certification, it's not just the building and its materials. It's even how many people are walking to the building, and how many people are using public transport to the building, and how many people are using their private cars to the building when they're commuting to and fro every single day. So if I am making a building which is completely isolated and in the middle of the desert, and there is no way to reach it except with a car, then of course I am going to flunk in that specific clause or subclause. But if at this earlier stage, before even the site is absolutely decided, before the land is purchased, I have this in mind and someone is there to remind me that even this would help me get the certification, in that case, the decision can be more thoughtful to buy the land or to choose the site at such a place where there is public transport connectivity, where it is walkable from maybe some certain residential or high density areas, where it is closer to maybe a mall where people would already have existing infrastructure to connect. So those things can help.
All right. So now moving to my next question, how do you see technology from energy modeling to AI-driven optimization influencing sustainable design making in the design process?
Mhm. So AI is an excellent tool that we have at our disposal now. We could not cover it in this presentation because I think that in itself would be another hour-long presentation if we try to go there. But AI
In one
is an
sentence.
excellent,
Yeah.
Okay. It is an excellent tool that can help us optimize our buildings further. There are things that it can help us with. There are shortcomings that we have. There are drawbacks that are there in our softwares. We can bridge the gap with AI.
Hmm, 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 Right. So maybe more efficiency in the design decision process through AI, and that's something that may happen in the energy modeling processes as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so coming to my last two questions. What advice would you give to young architects entering the field of sustainable design in the Middle East?
I would say unlearn and relearn for every different project. Whatever you have from your, like if someone grew up here, then of course they would have a certain understanding. If someone grew up somewhere and migrated to Dubai or to the Gulf, they would have their own pre-existing notions about buildings and architecture. I would say for every project, unlearn and relearn.
Hmm, hmm. Nice. And if you could summarize your design philosophy for desert environments in one line, what would that be?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Um, I would again say unlearn and relearn, because even like where I ended the last slide, that is sort of my philosophy, because there are so many different phases of desert architecture. There's not one kind of desert architecture, there's not one building that is the model desert architecture building. There are so many different phases.
Hmm.
So it's just so diverse. For every project, unlearn and relearn.
All right, wonderful. So keep growing and keep learning. That's the
Thank
message going
you.
out to all of the young architects and designers out there. Before we close, let's just quickly take a look at any questions from the audience. So, yes, we do have a question from the audience.
Can technology like smart home systems actually change user behavior towards more sustainable living? Absolutely, because of two aspects. One, when we are aware of the system that exists, it informs us more. And the other, we are informed now, but then we don't manually have to change everything. We don't manually have to alter our habits. For example, the lights will automatically go off if there's no one, if there's no movement in the room, if there's no one there. The bathroom lights in public buildings, for example, in office buildings and stuff, the bathroom lights, to when the door opens, when the sensor is activated, then the lights switch on. So A, it makes us more aware, these smart home systems, intelligent building systems in general, and B, it reduces the dependence for energy conservation on us. So we don't manually have to do everything, the smart home does it for us. So absolutely, it can change user behavior. And then when we see the convenience of it, we don't manually have to do it. We are more inclined towards using it, incorporating it. Thank you for the
All
question, Shukla.
right. Thank you very much for that question. Any other questions? All right. So no other questions at the moment. However, I think there will be questions coming in over the next week or two as people kind of see this webinar and kind of absorb and think about, reflect on the things that we've discussed. So thank you very much, Mariam. At this point, we come to the end of this webinar. Um, Thank you very much for the insightful and grounded presentation. It was
Thank
inspiring to see how sustainability and design excellence can coexist, especially in high rise and luxury developments where comfort, beauty, and environmental responsibility often have to find a balance. Your reflections on microclimate design, shading, and human scale connections gave us a clear reminder that sustainability isn't just a feature, it's a mindset that starts with empathy for people and place. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for your thoughtful questions and engagement today. Conversations like this help us move the industry forward from awareness to real on ground change. We'll continue exploring new perspectives in this series every Sunday, right here at Designing for the Desert. Until then, stay curious, stay climate conscious, and keep designing with purpose. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.